Picture this, the scent of exotic spices drifting through a crowded marketplace, the glint of silk unfurling under the Mediterranean sun, the weight of African gold changing hands in a distant port city. These weren't just moments of commerce, they were the threads weaving together the tapestry of medieval civilization. For centuries, trade routes stretched like veins across continents, pulsing with goods, ideas, and cultures that shaped the world as we know it. But this story isn't just about what was bought and sold. It's about how a handful of dusty paths and winding sea lanes became the invisible scaffolding of empires, the silent architects of progress. Think about the last time you held something that traveled thousands of miles to reach you: a cup of coffee, a piece of fabric, even the device you're watching this on. That connection across distance, it's a tradition as old as the Silk Road itself. Back then, the journey of a single bolt of silk from China to Rome could take years, passing through the hands of countless merchants, crossing deserts and mountains, surviving bandits and storms. And yet, people made it happen. Why? Because trade wasn't just about profit. It was about survival, innovation, and the human urge to reach beyond the horizon. Cities rose and fell based on their place along these routes. Fortunes were made, languages blended, and religions spread. The medieval world wasn't built by kings and armies alone. It was built by caravans and ship captains, by haggling in market stalls and sharing stories around campfires under the stars. So let's set sail or saddle up, depending on the route, and trace these ancient highways of exchange. From the sprawling networks of the Silk Road to the lesser-known but equally vital Amber Road, we'll follow the footsteps of those who dared to bridge continents. You'll meet the unsung heroes of history, the merchants who risked everything for a load of pepper, the port cities that became melting pots of culture, the inventions that leaped from one civilization to another and changed everything. By the time we're done, you'll see medieval trade not as a dry list of goods and taxes, but as a living, breathing force that shaped art, science, and even the borders on our maps today. This is the story of how the world grew smaller, one transaction at a time, and trust me, it's a journey worth taking. The Silk Road was more than just a highway for luxury goods. It was the internet of the medieval world, connecting distant civilizations in ways that transformed them forever. Picture a caravan of camels laden with silk and spices, trudging through the deserts of Central Asia. Each bale of fabric carried more than just material value. It held the secrets of Chinese sericulture, a technology so closely guarded that revealing it was punishable by death. Yet ideas have a way of slipping through borders, and soon Persian weavers were creating their own versions, while Roman aristocrats flaunted the shimmering fabric as a status symbol. But silk was just the beginning. Along those same dusty trails traveled paper-making techniques from China, which would eventually revolutionize record-keeping in the Islamic world and later Europe. Astrolabes from the Middle East reached the hands of European navigators, changing how sailors charted the seas. Even something as simple as the stirrup, carried westward by nomadic tribes, reshaped medieval warfare by giving knights greater stability in combat. The Silk Road didn't just move goods, it moved the building blocks of civilization itself. Cities along the route became dazzling hubs of exchange. Take Samarkand, where Persian, Indian, and Chinese merchants haggled in sprawling bazaars under blue-tiled domes. Here, a trader might overhear mathematical concepts from India that would later become the Arabic numerals we use today, or witness the intricate dance of cultures as Buddhist monks debated Islamic scholars in the shadow of Zoroastrian temples. These weren't just market towns, they were idea factories where the medieval world's greatest innovations collided and combined. Yet for all its wonders, the Silk Road had a darker side. The same caravans that carried silks and spices also unwittingly transported the fleas that spread the Black Death. By the mid-14th century, this invisible stowaway had traveled from Central Asian rodents to European cities, wiping out nearly half the continent's population in one of history's deadliest pandemics. It's a stark reminder that connection comes with risk, a lesson that feels all too familiar even today. What made the Silk Road truly remarkable wasn't just its scale, but its ability to weave together the fates of empires. When Chinese dynasties faltered, Central Asian middlemen kept the routes alive. When Mongol conquerors like Genghis Khan unified the steppes, they didn't destroy the trade networks, they taxed and protected them, creating an unprecedented era of safe passage from Beijing to Baghdad. Even religions traveled these paths, with Buddhism following the trade routes east into China while Nestorian Christianity moved westward. The Silk Road didn't just connect places, it rewrote the map of human civilization, one loaded camel at a time. While the Silk Road connected east and west, Northern Europe had its own revolutionary trade network, one not built on silk or spices, but on salted herring and timber. Imagine the bustling ports of 14th century Lübeck, where ships groaned under cargoes of amber, furs, and grain, their sails emblazoned with the distinct symbols of the Hanseatic League. This wasn't just a loose collection of merchants, it was a medieval superpower, a coalition of guilds so wealthy and well-organized that kings borrowed from their coffers and trembled at their influence. At its peak, the League's reach stretched from London's smoky wharfs to the frozen markets of Novgorod, with nearly 200 cities bound together by trade agreements and mutual protection. Their secret, control over essentials. While Southern Europe obsessed over luxuries, the Hansa dealt in the backbone of medieval life, Norwegian timber for shipbuilding, Baltic grain to feed growing cities, and mountains of salted herring that kept Europe fed during lean winters. In an era before refrigeration, the League's mastery of fish preservation alone made them indispensable. But this was more than just commerce, it was a quiet revolution in governance. The League operated like a medieval European Union, standardizing weights, settling disputes between members, and even issuing passports for merchants. Their contour trading posts, fortified compounds in foreign cities, became hubs of innovation. In Bergen's brigand district, German apprentices lived alongside Norwegian fishermen, exchanging not just goods but techniques that transformed ship design and navigation. When threatened, the Hansa didn't hesitate to flex its muscles. They financed wars, blockaded entire kingdoms that crossed them, and once even kidnapped a Danish king who dared disrupt their trade. Their naval power was so formidable that during the Anglo-Hanseatic War, English ships avoided direct confrontation, opting instead to negotiate. The message was clear: in Northern Europe, the merchant's ledger could be mightier than the monarch's sword. Yet their greatest legacy wasn't in battles won, but in cities built. The distinctive red brick Gothic architecture of Hanseatic ports from Tallinn to Gdansk still defines the Baltic coastline today. Their laws on fair pricing and contract enforcement became the bedrock of modern commercial codes. Even the concept of a trade bloc influencing politics feels strikingly familiar in our era of economic alliances. The League proved that cooperation could trump conquest, that shared prosperity could build something more enduring than any empire. Far north of the Mediterranean's bustling ports, where pine forests meet the cold Baltic Sea, hunters waded through shallow waters collecting lumps of golden resin washed ashore by ancient tides. This wasn't just any treasure, it was amber, fossilized tree sap glowing like captured sunlight, and it would become one of the medieval world's most coveted luxuries. The Amber Road, a network of trails stretching from Scandinavia to the Adriatic, turned this humble material into a currency of kings and a bridge between worlds. Unlike the Silk Road's sprawling caravans, amber moved in small, precious parcels. A single lump could buy a healthy slave in Rome, while larger pieces adorned Pharaoh Tutankhamun's burial mask. But its value went beyond beauty. Ancient healers ground it into powders believed to cure ailments, while Greek philosophers like Thales marveled at its static electricity, calling it electron, and sparking early experiments with this mysterious force. For northern European tribes, amber held spiritual power. They carved it into amulets to ward off evil, unknowingly creating some of humanity's earliest works of art. The route itself was a marvel of improvisation. With no single path, traders passed amber hand to hand, from Baltic gatherers to Germanic middlemen, down the Vistula and Elbe rivers to Celtic merchants, who finally delivered it to Roman buyers in Aquileia. This Italian city became the amber capital of the ancient world, its workshops transforming rough nuggets into intricate beads, figurines, and even windows for imperial villas. The trade was so lucrative that Emperor Nero once sent a knight north to investigate its source, marking one of history's first recorded economic expeditions. What made the Amber Road extraordinary was its ability to connect societies that barely knew each other's existence. A Viking Age trader in Hedeby might never see the marble halls where his amber eventually gleamed, but his livelihood depended on them. Meanwhile, Mediterranean artisans shaped raw material from lands they'd never visit into objects that defined elite status across empires. This indirect exchange created an early form of globalization, proof that even in antiquity, economies could intertwine across staggering distances. The road's legacy lingers in unexpected ways. When archaeologists unearthed a 3,000-year-old shipwreck off Turkey's coast, they found Baltic amber alongside Egyptian gold and Mesopotamian tin, a snapshot of how deeply interconnected the ancient world truly was. Centuries later, the same networks that moved amber would carry ideas, from Roman glassmaking techniques northward to Norse craftsmen, while Scandinavian designs appeared in Alpine markets. The Amber Road reminds us that trade was never just about wealth. It was the original social network, quietly weaving together the fabric of civilizations. Beneath the blistering sun of the Sahara, where shifting dunes stretch farther than the eye can see, a silent revolution was taking place, one powered not by armies, but by the steady plod of camel hooves and the clink of salt blocks against golden ingots. The Trans-Saharan trade routes were the lifelines of medieval Africa, transforming barren deserts into highways of wealth and ideas. Picture a caravan of 1,000 camels, each laden with slabs of salt mined from the heart of the desert, inching toward the gold-rich kingdoms of West Africa. That salt wasn't just a seasoning, it was a matter of life and death in the tropical south, where the body's need for minerals made it more precious than jewelry. Meanwhile, northbound caravans carried gold so abundant that Arab traders wrote of a ruler who could command an army to kneel simply by tossing a single nugget onto the ground. This exchange didn't just enrich traders, it built empires. Take ancient Ghana, where kings controlled the gold-salt balance so shrewdly that they taxed every ounce passing through their territory, growing wealthy enough to adorn their court with gold-embroidered silks and Arabian stallions. By the time Mali rose to power under Mansa Musa in the 14th century, the system had reached legendary proportions. His famed pilgrimage to Mecca, with a caravan of 60,000 people and camels laden with so much gold that it depressed prices in Cairo for years, wasn't just a religious journey. It was a calculated display of economic might that put West Africa on medieval world maps. But the Sahara's real secret weapon was the camel. These resilient creatures, introduced to Africa around the 3rd century, were the ultimate desert adaptation. Their humps stored fat for energy, their eyelids blocked sandstorms, and their wide feet floated over dunes that would swallow horses. A single camel could carry 400 pounds of cargo and travel days without water, turning impossible distances into profitable routes. Without them, the Sahara would have remained a barrier, not a bridge. The trade did more than move goods, it reshaped cultures. As Muslim merchants traversed the desert, they brought not just goods but the Quran, building mosques and schools in trading hubs like Timbuktu. By the 12th century, this once sleepy outpost had become an intellectual capital, its libraries overflowing with manuscripts on astronomy, medicine, and law. The Sankor University attracted scholars from across the Islamic world, proving that commerce could carry more than commodities, it could spread enlightenment. Yet the journey was never easy. Caravans faced sandstorms that erased trails, raiders who lurked at oases, and temperatures so extreme that salt blocks became currency for water. The risks were immense, but so were the rewards. When a caravan finally reached its destination, the celebration wasn't just about profit, it was a triumph over one of Earth's harshest landscapes. The Trans-Saharan trade reminds us that human ingenuity doesn't just adapt to the environment, it transforms barriers into opportunities, one gritty step at a time. While camel caravans plodded across deserts and merchants haggled in Baltic ports, an even grander spectacle unfolded across the turquoise waters of the Indian Ocean. Here, the real magic wasn't in the goods exchanged, though they were dazzling enough, but in how entire civilizations mastered the rhythm of the sea itself. Picture a day, how with Latin sails catching the summer monsoon, riding winds so predictable that ancient mariners could set their calendars by them. These weren't just ships. They were floating metropolises, carrying not only cinnamon and cloves but entire languages, religions, and technologies between continents. The secret to this maritime empire lay in nature's clockwork. Every April, traders from Arabia and Persia would catch the southwest monsoon to India, their hulls stuffed with frankincense and glassware. By October, the winds reversed, carrying them home with holds full of Malabar pepper and Sri Lankan pearls. This wasn't just convenient, it revolutionized trade by making voyages reliable enough to sustain permanent connections. Where Mediterranean sailors hugged coastlines in fear of open water, Indian Ocean navigators plotted courses straight across the deep, guided by stars and centuries of accumulated knowledge written in poems and pilot guides. At the heart of this network stood the humble coconut. More than just food, its fibers caulked ships, its shells became cups and ladles, and its oil preserved wood from voracious shipworms. The coconut palm was so vital that it spread from Southeast Asia to Africa, and beyond traces the routes of these early mariners. But the real stars of the show were spices. A single sack of cloves from the Maluku Islands could buy a villa in Alexandria, while nutmeg was so valuable that Arab traders spun tales of it growing in guarded valleys patrolled by giant birds. The ports that dotted these shores became crucibles of culture. In Zanzibar, Bantu fishermen traded with Omani merchants in a new tongue, Swahili, a linguistic mosaic of Arabic and African roots. Over in Cambay, Hindu gem cutters shaped diamonds for Jewish traders who'd sell them to Venetian buyers. The sheer diversity stunned visitors. One 14th century Moroccan traveler described Mogadishu's markets as places where a man could hear a dozen languages before breakfast. This trade didn't just enrich pockets, it reshaped geography itself. When Chinese Admiral Zheng, his treasure fleets arrived in East Africa in the 15th century, His ships were 10 times larger than anything Europe could build, carrying porcelain that still surfaces in Kenyan archaeological digs today. Meanwhile, the demand for Indian cotton textiles became so intense that fragments have been found as far as Egyptian mummy wrappings and Indonesian burial shrouds. The ocean wasn't a barrier. It was a connective tissue, binding together societies that might never meet on land but whose fates were intertwined by the ebb and flow of tides and trade winds. Yet the most enduring legacy might be invisible. The astrolabes perfected by Arab navigators in these waters would later guide European explorers. The financial instruments invented to fund risky voyages, partnerships, credit notes, even early insurance laid groundwork for modern capitalism. Even today, the scent of cardamom in a Dubai souk or the pattern on a batik cloth in Jakarta whispers of an ancient network that proved the world was always more connected than we imagined. The image of a Viking longship cutting through stormy seas usually conjures visions of axe-wielding raiders, but flip that script and you'd find those same ships packed with bundles of Arctic fox furs, casks of Baltic honey, and ingots of Islamic silver. The Vikings were as much merchants as marauders, and their trade routes stretched farther than their raids, weaving a web of exchange from the icy fjords of Norway to the sun-baked markets of Constantinople. What made Viking trade so revolutionary was their mastery of geography. They didn't just stick to coasts, they dragged their ships overland between rivers, creating shortcuts that turned Europe's waterways into a single interconnected system. Picture a crew hauling a longship on logs from the Baltic to the Black Sea, bypassing hostile territories to reach Byzantine gold. These portage routes were the medieval equivalent of shipping canals, and they gave the Vikings access to goods no one else could move. In Novgorod, Rus traders paid them in Slavic slaves. In Baghdad, Arab merchants weighed their silver dirhams against amber and walrus ivory. But the real genius lay in their adaptability. When raids became too risky, they pivoted to commerce. Dublin, founded as a raiding base, transformed into a bustling emporium where Gaelic hunters traded beaver pelts for Frankish wine. In York, Viking craftsmen produced goods so finely detailed that their designs reached India via middlemen. Even their notorious slave trade had a grim economic logic. Captives from Britain and Ireland were currency, traded east for the silver that fueled Scandinavia's first cash economy. The artifacts tell the story. A Swedish grave yields a Buddha statuette from Kashmir, while a Danish hoard spills Arabic coins engraved with the names of caliphs. These weren't just loot, they were proof of a network stretching across continents. The Vikings didn't just take, they facilitated. When a Norwegian trader buried a hoard of silver on Scotland's Isle of Lewis, he wasn't hiding wealth. He was creating a medieval banking system, marking spots to retrieve currency for future deals. Their legacy lingers in unexpected places. The Russian city of Kiev owes its early prosperity to Viking traders who organized Slavic settlements into a powerhouse. The word money itself traces back to a Viking mint in Normandy, and those iconic longships, their shallow drafts and speed made them perfect not just for raids, but for navigating the shallow rivers that became medieval Europe's commercial arteries. The Vikings remind us that history's most feared invaders were also its most ingenious unifiers, stitching together a fractured world with sails, silver, and sheer audacity. Imagine a field in 12th century France transforming overnight into a bustling metropolis of commerce, tents stretching as far as the eye could see, merchants haggling in a dozen languages, the clink of coins mingling with the shouts of dealers. This was the Champagne Fair, a biannual spectacle that turned sleepy French towns into the Wall Street of the medieval world. But these weren't just chaotic marketplaces. They were meticulously organized engines of finance, where a Flemish wool trader could secure credit from an Italian banker using a handwritten note, and that note could change hands half a dozen times before the debt came due. The genius of the Champagne fairs lay in their system. 6 fairs spanned the year across towns like Troyes and Provence, creating a continuous cycle of commerce that kept money flowing even in an age without permanent banks. Each fair followed a strict schedule: days for setting up, days for trading cloth and leather, days for spices and luxury goods, and finally, the critical days of payment when debts were settled. This wasn't just convenience, it was financial innovation. Merchants developed bills of exchange, early versions of checks, that allowed money to move across Europe without the risk of carrying heavy coinage. A trader could deposit funds with a banker in Genoa and withdraw them in Champagne, a system so reliable it became the backbone of international trade. What really set these fairs apart was their legal sophistication. The guardians of the fair acted like medieval regulatory agencies, resolving disputes, enforcing contracts, and even maintaining sealed sample weights to prevent fraud. Their courts operated on merchant law, swift, practical judgments based on custom rather than feudal privilege. If a German merchant defaulted on a debt, his goods could be seized before he left town, a level of accountability unheard of in most medieval societies. This legal safety net encouraged risk-taking. Traders ventured farther, deals grew larger, and new forms of partnership emerged that would later evolve into joint stock companies. Yet the fair's decline was as instructive as their rise. When the 100 Years' War disrupted land routes and Italian ships began sailing directly to Bruges and Southampton, the Champagne fairs lost their geographic advantage. But their legacy lived on in unexpected ways. The word bankruptcy comes from the Italian banca rota, literally a broken bench, referring to the tradition of smashing the tables of failed moneylenders at medieval fairs. The concept of credit ratings that traces back to fair officials keeping lists of trustworthy merchants. Even modern trade shows, with their booths and networking events, are distant echoes of those temporary cities of commerce where the medieval economy learned to think big. The Champagne fairs remind us that progress isn't always about permanent institutions. Sometimes it's the fleeting gatherings, the seasonal collisions of minds and goods that rewrite the rules. They proved that trust could be systematized, that paper could be as powerful as gold, and that even in an age of knights and castles, the real power often lay with the merchants quietly building the future in a field full of tents. A merchant pauses at a Silk Road caravanserai, unrolling not just bolts of fabric but a delicate painting of a serene figure with elongated ears, his Buddhist devotional artwork catching the eye of curious locals. This quiet moment encapsulates how trade routes became the veins through which religions pulsed across continents. Buddhism's journey from India to China wasn't led by armies or emperors, but by monks hitching rides with merchant caravans, their sutras packed alongside silk and spices. The monasteries that sprouted along the Silk Road, like Dunhuang's Mogao caves, doubled as guest houses for traders, their walls covered in murals funded by pious merchants thanking deities for safe passage. Islam's expansion tells a similar story of commerce and creed intertwining. When Arab merchants arrived in Swahili port cities, they didn't just bring porcelain and glass. They built mosques with coral stone, marrying their architectural traditions with African craftsmanship. The Quran's emphasis on honest trade gave Muslim merchants an edge. Their reputation for fairness made conversion a practical choice for local rulers seeking stronger commercial ties. In Mali's Timbuktu, the Sankor Mosque became both a spiritual center and a hub for negotiating gold deals, proving that prayer mats and trade contracts could share the same space. Christianity's northern journey took a different path. Viking traders encountering Byzantine crosses in Constantinople initially valued them merely as exotic loot, until they noticed how these symbols opened doors in southern markets. Soon, Scandinavian chieftains were commissioning Frankish silversmiths to create hybrid Thor's hammer cross pendants, hedging spiritual bets while smoothing trade relations. The conversion of Norse settlements like Kiev wasn't just about theology. It was a calculated move to access the vast Christian trading network stretching from Greenland to Jerusalem. Religions adapted ingeniously to local tastes along these routes. Buddhist artists in Gandhara sculpted the Buddha with Apollo-like features to appeal to Hellenistic traders, while Nestorian Christians in China framed Jesus as a luminous sage to resonate with Confucian scholars. In Zanzibar, Islamic calligraphy incorporated swirling motifs from Bantu art, creating a visual dialect that welcomed new adherents. This wasn't dilution, it was cultural translation on an epic scale. The exchange flowed both ways. Sufi mystics traveling with caravans absorbed Hindu meditation techniques, enhancing their spiritual practices. Armenian merchants introduced European Christians to the concept of Islamic Waqf endowments, inspiring the founding of medieval hospitals. Even religious calendars synchronized with trade cycles. Ramadan's conclusion often aligned with monsoon departures, ensuring spiritual and commercial celebrations coincided. Perhaps the most enduring legacy was the written word. Buddhist sutras copied in Dunhuang's caves preserved Sanskrit knowledge later lost in India. Arabic trading contracts from Cairo's Geniza documents reveal Jewish-Muslim business partnerships thriving under Islamic law. Viking runestones bearing crosses marked not just faith but participation in a pan-European economic community. These routes didn't just transport goods, they became the parchment on which civilizations wrote their shared future. The Mongol Empire's conquests left a trail of destruction so vast that medieval chroniclers described them as a literal act of God. Yet in the ashes of those campaigns arose something extraordinary, the largest free trade zone the world had ever seen. When Genghis Khan's warriors unified the steppes in the early 13th century, they didn't just create an empire, they dismantled every toll booth, bandit stronghold, and petty kingdom that had choked the Silk Road for centuries. What emerged was the Pax Mongolica, a Mongol peace so profound that a traveler could walk from Budapest to Beijing with a sack of gold and nothing but a diplomatic pass for protection. At the heart of this system was a simple but revolutionary Mongol principle. Trade was sacrosanct. Khans executed officials who harassed merchants, built way stations every 30 kilometers with fresh horses and supplies, and even standardized weights and measures across continents. The famed Yam Courier network, with its relay stations staffed by thousands of riders, didn't just carry military orders, it became the medieval equivalent of a global postal service, allowing Persian astronomers to send observations to Chinese scholars in weeks rather than years. This wasn't just security, it was globalization at breakneck speed. Consider Marco Polo's journey. The Venetian merchant's legendary travels weren't possible because he was brave. They were possible because the Mongols had turned Eurasia into a highway. His descriptions of paper money, coal burning, and imperial postal systems weren't just exotic tales. They were glimpses of technologies flowing westward along Mongol-secured routes. Gunpowder, which had been a Chinese curiosity for centuries, reached Europe in Mongol saddlebags, forever altering warfare. Persian miniature painting techniques migrated east to influence Yuan dynasty art, while Tibetan Buddhist advisors found themselves counseling Khans in Karakoram. The Mongols themselves were the ultimate middlemen. Though they famously cared little for luxury, they understood its value to others. When a Mongol prince received a gift of European glassware, he didn't display it, he traded it to a Chinese official for 5 times its weight in silk. Their capital at Karakoram became a bizarre bazaar where Russian furs, Indian jewels, and Arabian perfumes changed hands under the watchful eyes of scribes recording every transaction in Aiker script. Even their reputation for brutality served commerce, knowing that banditry invited annihilation. Tribes from the Caucasus to the Gobi kept the peace. Yet the true legacy of the Pax Mongolica wasn't just in what moved, but how fast. Before the Mongols, an idea might take generations to cross continents. Now it could happen within a lifetime. When the Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, it did so along the very trade routes the Mongols had polished to efficiency, a grim reminder that connectivity cuts both ways. By the time the empire fragmented, it had already reshaped the world's economic DNA, proving that even history's most feared conquerors could become history's most unlikely unifiers. The Mongols didn't just ride across the map, they stitched it together, leaving behind a world where distances felt smaller and possibilities stretched further than anyone had dreamed. Venice didn't just rise from the Adriatic's waters, it defied them. Built on a labyrinth of wooden pilings driven into salt marshes, this improbable city became the financial and maritime powerhouse of medieval Europe through sheer ingenuity. Imagine a place with no farmland, no freshwater springs, and streets made of liquid, yet whose merchants could undercut prices in Paris and outmaneuver sultans in Alexandria. Venice's secret wasn't just its gilded churches or its navy. It was a system so ruthlessly efficient that the modern concept of a corporation owes more to Venetian trade contracts than to any medieval kingdom. At the heart of their empire lay the galley, not the sleek warships of Hollywood, but broad-beamed vessels with crews of rowers who doubled as crossbowmen. These were the 18-wheelers of their day, hauling everything from Cypriot sugar to Crimean slaves in carefully organized state convoys called mude. Twice a year, Venice's Great Council would auction off these trading routes to merchant syndicates, with bids so competitive that the contracts included clauses forbidding captains from even leaning on their cargo to prevent damage. The system turned risk into mathematics. Insurers calculated premiums based on pirate activity in the Aegean, while shipbuilders at the arsenal could produce a battle-ready galley in less time than it took to grow a crop of wheat. But Venice's real genius was in playing both sides. When the Fourth Crusade veered wildly off course in 1204, it wasn't due to religious fervor. It was because Venetian Doge Enrico Dandolo, nearly blind and in his 80s, manipulated crusaders into sacking Christian Constantinople to settle the city's trading debts. The loot that flooded back, including the 4 bronze horses now towering over St. Mark's Basilica, wasn't just plunder, it was a calculated move to cripple a commercial rival. Meanwhile, Venetian merchants in Alexandria bribed Mamluk officials to maintain access to Indian spices, even as their priests condemned Islam from pulpits at home. The city's financial innovations were centuries ahead of their time. Their banco system, literally a bench where moneychangers sat, gave us the word bank, while their invention of government bonds prestiti allowed ordinary citizens to invest in trade expeditions. A Venetian housewife might own shares in a cargo of Persian silks, her dividends paid in the gold ducats that became the medieval equivalent of the US dollar. Even their spies operated like a modern intelligence agency, with ambassadors filing coded reports on crop yields in Damascus or political unrest in Trebizond, information that gave Venetian traders an edge in every market. Yet Venice's greatest commodity was cultural. The glassmakers of Murano, forbidden on pain of death from sharing their techniques, produced mirrors so clear they revolutionized Renaissance art. Armenian merchants trading in the Rialto brought Persian carpet designs that inspired Venetian textile patterns still copied today. Even Marco Polo's famous travels began as a family business trip, his father and uncle establishing trading posts in Crimea decades before their son's epic journey. The city's decline came not from any single defeat, but from the slow shift of history's currents. When Portuguese navigators rounded Africa in 1498, bypassing Venetian middlemen to reach Indian spices directly, it was like a digital startup disrupting an old-world monopoly. Yet Venice's legacy lingers in every stock market, every shipping contract, every boardroom where risk is calculated and rewards divided. This wasn't just a city built on trade, it was the place where commerce learned to wear a crown. Behind the armored facade of the Knights Templar lay an unexpected truth. These warrior monks weren't just crusaders, they were the medieval equivalent of a multinational bank. Picture a French pilgrim depositing silver coins at a Templar preceptory in Paris, then walking into a fortress in Jerusalem months later to withdraw the exact amount in gold bezants, minus a small fee. This wasn't magic, it was the birth of international banking born from the chaos of the Crusades. The Templars' genius was realizing that faith could collateralize finance. Their network of fortified monasteries doubled as secure vaults, while their reputation for incorruptibility, backed by threats of excommunication for embezzlers, made them the trusted middlemen between kings and merchants. But the real innovation was in their paperwork. Templar letters of credit allowed pilgrims to travel without carrying purses of gold, a system so reliable that even kings used it. When King Louis Roman VII needed funds during the Second Crusade, the Templars advanced him money against future French tax revenues, essentially inventing the government bond. Their ledgers recorded transactions with meticulous detail, including early forms of interest disguised as voluntary donations to skirt church usury laws. At their peak, they managed assets for everyone from English wool merchants to Byzantine emperors, their financial web stretching further than their swords ever could. Florence's Medici family took this financial revolution and added Renaissance flair. Where the Templars dealt in faith and swords, the Medicis traded in art and influence. Their banking empire rested on two breakthroughs: the gyro system allowing money transfers between accounts across Europe, and the lettera di cambio, a bill of exchange so sophisticated it functioned like modern currency futures. A silk merchant in Bruges could purchase goods from a Medici agent using a bill payable in Venice 6 months later, with exchange rates locked in to hedge against fluctuating currencies. The Medici secret wasn't just in moving money, but in laundering reputation. By commissioning artworks from Donatello and Botticelli, they transformed profits from interest, still technically sinful, into patronage of divine beauty. Their ledgers reveal the duality: one page recording loans to popes at hefty interest, the opposite page listing donations to build orphanages. This delicate balance of piety and profit created something unprecedented, a world where banking wasn't just tolerated but celebrated. What truly changed the game was the concept of fractional reserve banking. When the Medicis realized not all depositors would withdraw funds simultaneously, they began lending out portions of the money they held, collecting interest on capital that wasn't technically theirs. This practice, now the foundation of modern finance, supercharged economic growth but also introduced risk, as the Peruzzi and Bardi banking families discovered when Edward Roman III of England defaulted on war loans in the 1340s, triggering Europe's first international banking collapse. The real legacy of these medieval financiers lies in their invention of trust as a tradable commodity. A Templar cross or Medici coat of arms became trademarks guaranteeing quality, much like modern credit ratings. Their systems birthed concepts we take for granted, from checks to holding companies, proving that the pen or quill could indeed be mightier than the sword. When Cosimo de' Medici quipped that money is the sinews of war, he undersold its power. It had become the lifeblood of civilization itself, flowing through parchment channels these pioneers carved into history. The Norse longship slicing through icy waves wasn't just a feat of brute strength, it was a masterpiece of calculated design. With its shallow draft capable of navigating rivers just 3 feet deep, yet sturdy enough to cross the open Atlantic, this vessel became the ultimate medieval multi-tool. Viking shipbuilders used axes rather than saws, splitting oak along its natural grain to create planks that flexed with the sea instead of fighting it. The result, ships so light they could be carried overland, yet so strong they weathered storms that would sink lesser crafts. These weren't just boats, they were the pickup trucks of the Viking Age, equally suited for raiding monasteries or hauling Siberian furs to Byzantine markets. Half a world away, Arab shipwrights were solving different problems with equal ingenuity. The Howe, with its distinctive triangular lateen sail, could tack against the wind, a game-changer in the Indian Ocean's unpredictable monsoons. Builders stitched hulls with coconut fiber rather than nails, creating flexible frames that absorbed the shock of coral reefs. Some Hows grew so large they carried hundreds of passengers and crew, their holds stacked with porcelain from China and ivory from Africa. The real secret lay in the details: waterproofing made from shark liver oil, compartments designed to keep cargo dry even when waves crashed over the deck, and stern-mounted rudders that gave captains unprecedented control. But ships were only half the equation. Without navigation tools, even the sturdiest vessel was blind. Enter the astrolabe, a pocket-sized planetarium that allowed sailors to calculate latitude by aligning its brass rings with the sun or stars. Muslim scholars perfected this Persian invention, engraving intricate coordinate tables for ports from Aden to Zanzibar. Then came the compass, likely adapted from Chinese geomantic tools by Arab traders who realized its magnetic needle didn't care about cloudy skies. These weren't just gadgets, they were the medieval equivalent of GPS, shrinking the mental map of the world with every voyage. The breakthrough came when these technologies fused. Portuguese caravels combined the Norse keel design with Arab triangular sails, adding compasses and astrolabes to create the first true ocean-going ships. Suddenly, captains could venture beyond sight of land with confidence. Venetian navigators kept portolan charts, detailed maps with wind roses showing precise sailing directions between ports. A Genoese sailor might use a tolto de martoloio to calculate his position after days of zigzagging against contrary winds, the medieval equivalent of a spreadsheet for dead reckoning. What made these innovations revolutionary wasn't their complexity, but their democratization. A humble Basque whaler could afford a simple version of the compass, letting him hunt farther offshore. Hanseatic cogs adopted sternpost rudders, doubling the cargo capacity of Baltic grain shipments. Even fishermen benefited. Improved nets and drying techniques meant their catches could feed cities hundreds of miles inland. The ocean stopped being barriers and became highways, carrying not just goods but ideas. A shipwright in Bristol might never meet his counterpart in Alexandria, but their shared solutions to currents and storms created an unspoken dialogue across cultures. The true testament to these advances lies in the journeys they enabled. When Zheng He's treasure fleet sailed to Africa in the 15th century, their 9-masted ships carried watertight bulkhead technology unknown in Europe. Meanwhile, Norse Nars routinely crossed the North Atlantic with cargo holds full of live sheep, floating farms sustaining settlements in Greenland. These weren't isolated feats, they were milestones in a global conversation of craftsmanship and courage. The age of exploration didn't begin with Columbus. It began centuries earlier, in the smoke of shipyards where artisans turned trees into bridges between worlds. The bustling ports and dusty caravan trails that had knitted the medieval world together now carried an invisible stowaway, one that would rewrite history in blood and grief. In 1346, a Mongol army besieging the Black Sea port of Kaffa catapulted plague-ridden corpses over the walls, unknowingly launching biological warfare. But the real weapon wasn't the corpses, it was the rats scurrying aboard Genos merchant ships fleeing the conflict, their flea-infested fur carrying Yersinia pestis to every Mediterranean harbor. Within months, the same galleys that had transported silks and spices became floating coffins, their crews dying at the oars as ships drifted into Messina with no one left to lower the sails. What made the Black Death so catastrophic was the very connectivity trade had created. Where earlier plagues might burn through a single region, this one rode the superhighways of commerce, reaching London via Flemish wool ships, Paris through wine barges on the Seine, and Novgorod along the fur routes of the Hanseatic League. The numbers defy comprehension. Florence lost 60,000 souls in 6 months. Entire villages from Norway to Egypt vanished from tax rolls, and the meticulous ledgers of Venetian notaries became macabre roll calls of the dead. In Cairo, historian Al-Makrizi described pyramids of corpses lining the streets, while Boccaccio's Decameron opens with wealthy Florentines fleeing to countryside villas, an early example of social distancing. Yet the pandemic's spread reveals medieval trade's astonishing efficiency. The plague moved at a pace of 2 to 5 miles per day, faster than any human traveler could walk, proving how seamlessly goods and people flowed across continents. Mongolian postal stations meant infected fleas could leap from rider to rider across the steppes. Italian bankers' letters warning of the disease arrived too late to halt shipments from plague cities. Even quarantine, a concept born in Venetian-controlled Ragusa, failed initially because no one understood fleas were the vectors. The world had built a dazzling network of exchange, but not the knowledge to control its dangers. The aftermath transformed society in unexpected ways. With a third of Europe dead, surviving laborers suddenly held unprecedented bargaining power. English peasants demanded and won higher wages, breaking the feudal system's grip. Venetian glassmakers, their ranks decimated, could command salaries that funded Renaissance art. The drop in population also shifted trade priorities. Less demand for bulk grain meant more investment in luxury goods like saffron and silk, accelerating the shift toward specialized commerce. Even religious art changed as traumatized communities commissioned gruesome Dance of Death frescoes, their skeletons a stark reminder of mortality's democracy. Some of the most profound changes were psychological. The constant presence of death bred both hedonism, as seen in the extravagant festivals of the Burgundian court, and deep piety, with endowments to churches surging. Jewish communities, falsely accused of poisoning wells, faced brutal pogroms that reshifted medieval demographics as survivors fled east. Meanwhile, the medical profession, utterly powerless against the plague, lost prestige, paving the way for empirical observation to challenge ancient Gaelic theories. Perhaps the greatest irony lies in the plague's role as both destroyer and catalyst. The labor shortage spurred technological innovation like water-powered fulling mills in England. Depopulated farmlands reverted to pasture, boosting wool production that would later fuel Flanders' textile boom. Even international trade rebounded faster than expected, with Catalan merchants re-establishing Alexandria spice routes within a decade. The world learned a terrible lesson. Connectivity came with vulnerability, but also resilience. As graveyards filled, the survivors, fewer in number but richer in resources, began rebuilding the very networks that had betrayed them, this time with a wary eye toward the next invisible threat lurking in the holds of ships and the packs of merchants. The medieval world had discovered globalization's double edge. A pinch of pepper could buy a man's freedom in medieval Europe, and a single pound of nutmeg was worth half a year's wages. These weren't just spices, they were currency, status symbols, and sometimes even ransom payments. But why did something as simple as a dried berry command such astronomical prices? The answer lies in a perfect storm of scarcity, danger, and human desire. Take saffron, the most expensive spice by weight in history. To produce just 1 pound required 75,000 hand-picked crocus flowers, each plucked at dawn when their delicate stigmas were most potent. The labor alone made it precious, but the journey from Persian fields to European kitchens multiplied its value exponentially. Caravans crossing bandit-infested mountains lost pack animals to falls, while pirates stalked the Mediterranean shipping lanes. By the time those crimson threads reached a Venetian kitchen, they'd passed through so many hands that their cost rivaled gold. Silk's mystique was even more carefully cultivated. Chinese emperors guarded sericulture like a state secret, executing anyone caught smuggling silkworm eggs beyond their borders. The process was astonishingly laborious. Unraveling the cocoons of 5,000 silkworms yielded just 1 pound of raw silk, with skilled weavers spending months transforming it into shimmering fabric. When Byzantine monks finally smuggled silkworms to Constantinople in hollow walking sticks during the 6th century, they didn't just break a monopoly, they stole the ancient world's most closely held industrial secret. Yet nothing compared to the allure of spices from the distant Moluccas, the so-called Spice Islands. Cloves grew nowhere else on earth, their fragrant buds harvested by climbing trees taller than cathedral spires. Cinnamon came from the inner bark of Sri Lankan trees, peeled in strips so thin it took thousands to fill a cargo hold. The journey to fetch them defied imagination. Arab dives sailed past cyclones in the Indian Ocean, while monsoon winds dictated rigid departure windows. One delay could mean waiting a full year for the next favorable wind. The economics of these goods created bizarre paradoxes. In 12th century England, a pound of pepper could pay a night's rent for months, yet nobles sprinkled it lavishly on bland meats to flaunt their wealth. Venetian merchants stockpiled spices during gluts, then burned portions publicly to maintain artificial scarcity, an early example of market manipulation. Even the church got involved, accepting peppercorns as tithes and using nutmeg as communion incense. What's often overlooked is how these luxuries trickled down. A Flemish weaver might never taste ginger, but her labor carding wool bought the English merchant spice imports possible. The silver mined by German peasants ended up in Arab souks, traded for cinnamon that eventually graced a French duke's table. This wasn't just conspicuous consumption, it was an economic engine that connected peasant huts to royal courts across continents. The true power of these goods lay in their transformation of the ordinary. A dash of cardamom turned stale bread into a delicacy, while silk drapes made drafty stone halls feel regal. In a world where most lives were short, hard, and monochrome, spices and silks offered sensory magic, a fleeting taste of the exotic that made the medieval world feel vast and wondrous. Their value wasn't just in what they were, but in what they represented: the human capacity to cross mountains, oceans, and cultural divides in pursuit of beauty and flavor. Salt crusted the lips of Roman legionnaires as their wages were paid in this precious mineral, not gold, not silver, but the humble crystal that kept empires fed. In medieval Europe, salt wasn't just a flavor enhancer, it was the lifeblood of survival. Without refrigeration, salting fish and curing meats meant the difference between feast and famine through long winters. The bustling salt markets of Lüneburg and Krakow weren't just trading hubs, they were the beating hearts of entire economies, where a single cartload could buy a farmer's freedom or fund a knight's armor. Deep beneath the Austrian Alps, miners at Hallstatt chipped salt from glowing veins by lamplight, their tunnels descending like staircases into the earth. This Celtic salt, preserved in ancient mines for over 7,000 years, became the foundation of one of Europe's oldest continuous industries. The miners' leather backpacks, designed to carry heavy salt blocks up narrow shafts, became so iconic they influenced regional fashion for centuries. But Hallstatt was just one node in a vast network. Along France's Atlantic coast, workers evaporated seawater in endless clay pans, while in Timbuktu, camel caravans carried Saharan salt slabs southward, trading them pound for pound with gold dust from Mali's mines. The French crown's grip on salt reveals its strategic importance. The hated gay bell tax turned salt smuggling into a national pastime, with clandestine routes winding through forests and underground tunnels. In Venice, the state maintained a salt monopoly so lucrative it funded much of the city's naval power. Merchants were required to ship specified quantities on every voyage, creating artificial scarcity that kept prices high. Even the word salary stems from the Latin salarium, the salt allowance given to Roman soldiers. War followed salt like shadow follows light. When Venice and Genoa clashed in the 14th century, control over Adriatic salt pans was a prime objective. Poland's Wieliczka mine became a treasure vault so vital that visiting dignitaries received souvenir salt sculptures, a medieval PR stunt showcasing national wealth. In sub-Saharan Africa, the salt-gold exchange fueled the rise of empires like Ghana, whose kings taxed every ounce crossing their borders. A single Trans-Saharan caravan might include 10,000 camels, each carrying 4 massive salt slabs lashed to their sides, a procession stretching farther than the eye could see. Yet salt's greatest legacy wasn't in palaces or battlefields, but in everyday life. Herring packed in Baltic salt fed Hansa cities through Lenten fasts, while English wool merchants relied on salted cod to provision ships. The very layout of cities reflected salt's flow. Warehouses clustered near ports, toll stations sprang up along salt roads, and taverns serving salted provisions dotted pilgrimage routes. From the spiced salt blends favored by Arab physicians to the brined vegetables preserving vitamins through winter, this unassuming mineral quietly shaped diets across continents. Perhaps the most poetic testament lies in Hallstatt's prehistoric salt men, their bodies perfectly preserved for millennia in the mines where they worked. Like the civilizations they unknowingly sustained, they were pickled in time by the very substance that made their world possible, proof that sometimes history's most transformative forces come not in glittering treasures, but in gritty crystals rubbed between fingertips. In the bustling markets of medieval Europe, a merchant unfurled a bolt of English wool so fine it shimmered like liquid silver, a treasure more coveted than jewels by the right buyer. This wasn't just fabric, it was the foundation of empires. England's sheep outnumbered people 3-1 during the 13th century, their fleeces so central to the economy that royal seals depicted lambs and export taxes on wool funded the 100 Years' War. But transforming raw fleece into Flemish broadcloth required an industrial alchemy spanning continents. Fleeces shipped from London's Wool Wharf reached Bruges dye vats, where artisans used rare Kermes insects from the Mediterranean to produce scarlets worth their weight in gold. The real magic happened in the water-powered fulling mills of Flanders. Here, hammers pounded woolen cloth for days in troughs of stale urine, a process that shrank and strengthened the fibers. The stench was legendary, but the result was fabric so dense it could shed rain like a duck's feathers. These wet techniques gave Flemish weavers an edge that made their cities wealthy. In Ghent, the cloth halls towered over cathedrals, their vaults storing woolens destined for Venetian galleys bound for Alexandria. A single shipment might include cloth woven from English wool, dyed with Indian indigo, and trimmed with Baltic furs, a global product before the word globalization existed. Cotton traveled even farther. Egyptian growers along the Nile perfected irrigation techniques, yielding fibers so fine they rivaled silk. Arab traders carried these gossamer threads to Sicily, where Norman rulers established royal workshops staffed by Muslim weavers. The resulting tur as fabrics, embroidered with gold Arabic calligraphy, became status symbols from Cordoba to Constantinople. But the real revolution came when Italian merchants reverse-engineered cotton production, planting fields in Lombardy and powering looms with alpine rivers. By the 14th century, Milanese cotton-linen blends clothed everyone from Florentine bankers to German peasants. The textile trade birthed medieval Europe's first labor movements. In Florence, the Ciompi wool workers revolted in 1378, demanding fair wages and political representation. Their uprising briefly toppled the aristocracy, proving economic power could challenge feudal hierarchies. Meanwhile, textile guilds became shadow governments. The Art della Lana in Florence controlled 1/3 of the city's wealth, while the Hanseatic League's cloth standards ensured uniform quality from Novgorod to London. These weren't just trade associations, they were the blueprints for modern commerce, complete with trademarks, quality controls, and even early forms of workers' compensation. What made textiles extraordinary wasn't just their economic value, but their cultural fluidity. Persian carpet motifs appeared in French tapestries, while Chinese silk patterns inspired Venetian velvets. A single bolt of cloth might incorporate Spanish wool, Syrian dyes, and Flemish craftsmanship before adorning a Mongolian noble's robe. This endless recombination mirrored the medieval world itself, a patchwork of influences where borders blurred with every threaded needle. When excavators unearthed a Viking grave in Norway, they found the buried chief wrapped in cloth from Byzantium, his final rest swaddled in the very fabric of the interconnected world he'd helped weave. The bustling markets of medieval Europe and the Middle East weren't just filled with spices and silks, they teemed with human cargo. In the shadows of Cairo's grand bazaars, African captives stood on wooden platforms while Arab merchants inspected their teeth and muscles like livestock. Along Dublin's muddy wharves, Norse traders haggled over Gaelic prisoners, their fate hanging on the weight of silver coins. Even in the glittering heart of Constantinople, enslaved Slavs operated the mighty water mills that fed the Byzantine Empire. This was slavery on an industrial scale, a brutal engine that powered the very economies that built cathedrals, funded voyages, and stocked the palaces of caliphs and kings. The Viking slave trade was especially systematic. Raiding parties from Scandinavia didn't just seek treasure, they targeted people. A single expedition to the British Isles could net hundreds of captives, from monks snatched from coastal monasteries to farmers taken in dawn raid. These prisoners became the medieval equivalent of liquid currency. In the Volga river markets, a strong male slave fetched the price of a herd of reindeer, while a skilled female weaver could buy a Norse chieftain a new set of weapons. The demand was so insatiable that Viking traders established permanent slave emporiums in places like Hedeby and Bolgar, where captives from Ireland might be sold to Persian buyers, their journeys spanning continents in chains. Across the Mediterranean, the Arab slave trade operated on even grander scales. Zanj captives from East Africa toiled in the salt marshes of southern Iraq, their rebellions shaking the Abbasid Caliphate. Eunuchs trafficked from the Balkans guarded harems in Cordoba, while Sudanese archers formed elite military units in Cairo. The sheer volume defies modern imagination. Historian Ibn Batlan estimated that 10th century Baghdad imported over 1,000 African slaves monthly. What made this system particularly harrowing was its racialization. Arab writers like al-Jahiz propagated pseudoscientific theories about African inferiority, laying groundwork for prejudices that would echo through centuries. Byzantium's reliance on enslaved labor reveals slavery's institutional depth. The empire's legal code meticulously categorized slaves, from war captives to debt bonds, men, while granting masters near absolute power. Slavic youths were so prized as domestic servants that Venetian merchants specialized in their transport, branding them like merchandise. Yet even here, contradictions emerged. Some enslaved individuals rose to astonishing prominence, like the eunuch general Narses who reconquered Italy for Emperor Justinian. The Byzantine Church preached that slavery was a spiritual condition, offering manumission as an act of piety, yet never challenging the system itself. The economic impact of this trade was staggering. Viking silver dirhams found from Ireland to Afghanistan trace back to slave sales. The wealth of the Mali Empire, famous for Mansa Musa's gold, partly stemmed from selling war captives to Arab buyers. In Sicily, Norman kings taxed slave shipments at busy ports like Palermo, using the revenue to build their golden chapels. The tragedy wasn't just in the scale, it was in how seamlessly slavery intertwined with every other trade. The same Venetian galleys carrying spices from Alexandria might return with human cargo, their holds scrubbed indifferently between shipments. What lingers today isn't just the historical horror, but its cultural aftershocks. The Arabic word abd, meaning both slave and black African, reveals how the trade warped language. Norse sagas casually mention thralls with no more moral weight than describing a piece of furniture. Even the word slave itself derives from Slav, reflecting how entire ethnic groups became synonymous with servitude. Yet resistance flickered persistently, from the Zanj rebels draining Abbasid resources to the escaped slaves forming maroon communities in North African mountains. The medieval slave trade forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The glittering achievements of this era, the cathedrals, the universities, the trade networks, were partly built on the backs of the nameless and the dispossessed. Their stories, often reduced to footnotes in account books, remind us that progress for some often came at unbearable cost to others. The same routes that carried silks and ideas also carried human suffering, woven inextricably into the fabric of the age. When a Chinese artisan dipped a bamboo screen into a vat of pulped mulberry bark in the 1st century, he wasn't just making paper, he was unwittingly launching an information revolution that would circle the globe. This deceptively simple technology traveled west with Buddhist monks and Silk Road merchants, reaching Samarkand by the 8th century. There, Muslim artisans improved it by using linen rags instead of bark, creating sheets so smooth they made Arabic calligraphy dance across the page. By the time paper mills sprouted in Spain's Játiva Valley in the 12th century, the knowledge had leapfrogged continents, reducing Europe's dependence on expensive parchment and making books accessible beyond monastery walls. Windmills tell a similar story of incremental innovation across borders. Persian engineers first harnessed the wind's power with vertical sails in the 7th century, grinding grain in arid regions where watermills were impractical. Crusaders encountering these structures in the Middle East brought the concept home, but Northern European carpenters adapted them radically, switching to horizontal sails that could pivot to catch changing winds. The Dutch took it further in the 14th century, adding fantails to automatically adjust the sails, transforming marshes into farmland with their pumping mills. What began as a desert solution became the engine of Europe's agricultural revolution, all because ideas traveled as freely as the goods in merchants' packs. The most explosive transfer, quite literally, was gunpowder. Chinese alchemists discovered the mixture in the 9th century while seeking immortality, initially using it for fireworks. Mongol invasions spread the knowledge westward, where Arab chemists in Syria refined the formula into more potent military grades. By the 13th century, European artisans were casting the first bronze cannons, clumsy at first, but within decades, Ottoman engineers created monstrous bombards like the Dardanelles gun, capable of smashing Constantinople's walls in 1453. This cascade of improvements wasn't just about the substance itself, but the metallurgical knowledge that came with it, the bell casting techniques repurposed for cannon foundries, the Persian recipes for durable alloys. Less lethal but equally transformative were the navigational tools that shrank the medieval world. The astrolabe, perfected by Arab astronomers in Baghdad's House of Wisdom, allowed sailors to calculate latitude even under cloudy skies. Mediterranean traders combined this with the Chinese compass and Greek portolan charts to create an unprecedented toolkit for exploration. Venetian navigators kept logbooks tracking magnetic deviations centuries before scientists understood why compasses drifted, practical knowledge gained through trial and error on bustling trade routes. Perhaps the most underappreciated transfers were the humble technologies that revolutionized daily life. The Indian cotton gin, which mechanically separated seeds from fiber, reached Italy via Arab traders and supercharged Europe's textile industry. Persian qanats' underground irrigation tunnels allowed Andalusian farmers to turn Spanish deserts into lush gardens. Even something as simple as the horse collar, which migrated from China through Central Asia, transformed European agriculture by allowing horses to pull heavier plows than oxen, boosting crop yields to feed growing cities. These weren't just isolated inventions changing hands, they were sparks igniting chain reactions. Paper enabled record-keeping that made banking possible. Precise navigation tools reduced shipping risks and lowered trade costs. Improved agriculture fed the artisans who built the machines that drove further innovation. The medieval world didn't just exchange goods, it conducted a dialogue of ingenuity, where each culture added its verse to an epic poem of progress. When a German monk named Gutenberg combined Chinese paper, Korean movable type, and European wine presses to create his Bible in 1455, he was standing on the shoulders of 1,000 nameless traders who had carried these ideas across mountains and seas. The greatest commodity traded on those ancient routes wasn't silk or spice. It was the collective genius of humanity itself. A merchant captain in 14th century Genoa didn't just fear storms, he dreaded the sight of lateen sails on the horizon. Mediterranean waters teemed with corsairs, from North African Ghazis sanctioned by local rulers to opportunistic Christian renegades who'd swapped their crosses for crescents. These weren't lone wolves, they operated in fleets with spies in every port tipping them off about rich cargoes. One notorious raid in 1380 saw Tunisian pirates seize an entire Venetian galley laden with Cypriot sugar, a haul so valuable it funded a palace for the Hafsid Sultan. Yet piracy wasn't confined to sunlit southern seas. In the foggy Baltic, the Victual Brothers, a brotherhood of ex-privateers turned outlaws, held entire cities like Bergen hostage, demanding tribute from Hanseatic merchants. The response to this menace birthed systems still shaping global trade today. Venetian convoys, known as Mude, were the medieval equivalent of armored trucks, state-organized fleets with war galleys escorting merchant ships on fixed schedules. Their secret weapon wasn't just firepower but predictability. Pirates learned attacking a Muda meant facing the Serenissima's wrath. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, Qarani contracts emerged, early insurance policies where merchants pooled funds to ransom captured ships, a practice so widespread that Cairo had specialized notaries to record them. Legal innovations followed the bloodshed. The Consolat de Mar, a maritime code developed in Barcelona, established rules for dividing salvage, ransoming crews, and even compensating pirates' victims through port taxes. Its most radical idea, that piracy wasn't just a crime but a business risk to be managed, a notion that led to the first insurance premiums calculated by route danger. A spice shipment from Alexandria to Marseille might cost 5% extra if Barbary raids were frequent that season. Some merchants turned the tables by going on the offensive. The Hanseatic League didn't just build warehouses, they funded Friedensschiff, peace ships armed with crossbowmen and early cannon. When the Victual brothers grew too bold, Hanseatic admirals besieged their stronghold at Gotland in 1408, hanging captured pirates in gibbets visible from passing trade routes. Even the Knights Hospitaller, originally founded to protect pilgrims, diversified into naval patrols, their sleek galleys preying on pirate bases from Rhodes to Tripoli. The line between pirate and protector often blurred spectacularly. English letters of marque authorized captains like John Hawley to seize French ships during war, but many kept right on plundering in peacetime. Their paperwork conveniently expired. In Algiers, corsair captains built mansions with Venetian marble looted from Christian ships, while simultaneously offering protection contracts to Dutch merchants willing to pay for safe passage. What emerged from this chaos was a startling truth. Piracy, for all its violence, forced innovation. The need to secure loans against captured vessels birthed modern marine insurance. Pirate trials established universal jurisdiction, the idea that some crimes were so heinous any nation could prosecute them. Even the ubiquitous ship's manifest originated as proof cargo wasn't stolen. The medieval sea was no lawless void but a laboratory where the rules of global commerce were hammered out, often at cutlass point. The most enduring legacy might be psychological. When Genoese merchants commissioned notaries to record every bolt of cloth in triplicate, or when Venetian senators debated convoy schedules like military campaigns, they were acknowledging a fundamental shift. Trade wasn't just about profit, it was about managing risk across an interconnected world. The pirates who lurked beyond the horizon didn't just take cargo, they forced societies to invent new ways of trusting strangers across vast distances. Every insurance policy signed, every convoy assembled, whispered the same lesson. The price of prosperity was eternal vigilance. The golden age of medieval trade routes didn't collapse overnight. It unraveled like a frayed silk thread, tugged apart by shifting empires, daring navigators, and one cataclysmic siege. In May 1453, Ottoman cannons breached Constantinople's mighty walls, sending shockwaves across continents. The city that had bridged Europe and Asia for a millennium now flew the Sultan's crescent flag, its fall choking the overland Silk Road like a knot pulled tight. Venetian merchants who once paid Byzantine tariffs suddenly faced Ottoman officials demanding triple the duties, while Genoese trading posts along the Black Sea withered like unwatered vines. But the Ottomans weren't just gatekeepers, they were shrewd economists. By controlling both the Red Sea and Bosporus Straits, they could tax spices at their source and their destination, turning geography into a financial weapon. Yet, even as caravans dwindled, new routes were being carved across oceans. Portuguese caravels, their hulls stuffed with crates of Moroccan sugar and West African gold, began creeping further down the African coast. Prince Henry the Navigator's school at Sagres wasn't just training sailors, it was incubating a revolution. By 1488, Bartholomew Dias had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving Asia could be reached without crossing Muslim-controlled lands. Then came Vasco da Gama's bombshell voyage in 1498, a direct sea lane to India's pepper ports, cutting out the Arab middlemen who dominated the trade for centuries. The math was brutal, where a single Venetian galley might carry 10 tons of spices after paying Ottoman tolls. A Portuguese now could transport 600 tons tax-free. The consequences rippled through every marketplace from Aleppo to Antwerp. Venetian bankers watched their spice profits evaporate like monsoon puddles, while Lisbon's docks overflowed with pepper sacks. In Cairo, Mamluk sultans panicked as their transit taxes dried up, their once bustling warehouses gathering dust. Even the mighty Hanseatic League felt the tremors without eastern luxuries to distribute. Their northern trade network began unraveling like a poorly tied sail. But the most profound shift wasn't economic, it was psychological. Medieval trade had been a patchwork of shared risks and mutual dependencies. A Genos merchant might grumble about Mamluk officials but still break bread with Alexandrian brokers. The new Oceanic trade was conquest masquerading as commerce. Portuguese forts sprouted like thorns along African and Indian coasts, their cannons trained on rival ships. When Da Gama intercepted a Muslim pilgrim ship off Malabar in 1502, he burned it with 600 souls aboard, a far cry from the Silk Road's tradition of guarded coexistence. The medieval world's greatest strength, its interconnectedness, became its vulnerability. The same winds that once carried housed between Aden and Gujarat now filled the sails of carracks armed for empire. The ledgers that once recorded partnerships between Florentine bankers and Egyptian spice dealers now tallied the profits of forced monopolies. Even time itself seemed to accelerate. Where a Silk Road caravan might take 3 years for a round trip to China, Magellan's circumnavigation in 1522 proved the globe could be circled in months. What emerged from this turbulence was a world redrawn not by mutual exchange but by extraction. The medieval trade routes had been a tapestry, fragile at times, but woven with countless threads of cooperation. The age of exploration unraveled that fabric, replacing it with chains of colonial dominance. Yet echoes of the old ways linger in the Venetian merchants who pivoted to printing books when spices failed, in the Ottoman bazaars where Armenian and Jewish traders still negotiated under the watchful eyes of janissaries. The medieval routes didn't vanish, they faded like camel tracks swallowed by desert sands, leaving only their indelible imprint on the maps and the appetites of the modern world. The bustling markets of medieval Venice and the silent ledgers of Florentine bankers didn't just fade into history, they became the invisible blueprints for our modern world. That credit card in your wallet, its lineage traces back to the Commenda contracts of 12th century Genoa, where investors funded sea voyages in exchange for a share of profits, spreading risk like medieval venture capitalists. The sprawling container ships clogging today's ports, they're the spiritual descendants of Hanseatic cogs, whose standardized hull designs and cargo manifests first streamlined international shipping. Even the term freelance harks back to mercenary knights, freelancers hired by Italian city-states to protect their trade convoys, an early gig economy. Consider how medieval trade birthed the concept of economic interdependence. When the Champagne fairs introduced letters of credit, they didn't just simplify transactions. They created a system where a merchant in Bruges could trust a piece of paper signed by a banker he'd never met. This leap of faith across distances mirrors today's digital payments, where Bitcoin and Venmo rely on the same foundational trust. The Hanseatic League's trade treaties, with clauses on quality control and dispute resolution, read like proto-WTO agreements, proving that globalization isn't a modern invention but an evolution. The medieval world also grappled with supply chain disruptions that feel eerily familiar. A delay in the Nile's flood could spike pepper prices in London, just as a typhoon in Taiwan today might stall your laptop delivery. Venetian merchants stockpiled spices in anticipation of Mamluk political unrest, much like modern corporations hedge against semiconductor shortages. Even the Black Death's economic shockwaves, labor shortages leading to wage hikes and inflation mirror pandemic-era market turbulence. Culturally, these routes forged the first global tastes. The medieval obsession with Indian pepper and Chinese silk set the stage for today's Starbucks chai lattes and fast fashion rayon. The mewed convoy schedules of Venetian galleys evolved into just-in-time delivery systems, while the Mongol Empire's postal relays previewed instant communication. Perhaps the most enduring legacy is in the blurring of identities. Just as 14th century Swahili merchants blended Bantu and Arabic into a new language, today's fusion cuisines and hybrid genres echo that medieval alchemy of exchange. The next time you tap your phone to pay for a coffee brewed from Ethiopian beans in a Korean-owned cafe, remember, you're participating in a story that began with camel caravans and spice-laden dives, where the real cargo was never just goods, but the very idea of connection itself. Somewhere beneath the shifting sands of East Africa lies Raptor, a coastal emporium so wealthy that Roman geographers described its streets as paved with ivory and tortoiseshell, yet today, not a single stone of it has been found. This vanished city, mentioned in Ptolemy's 2nd century maps as the southernmost trading post of the ancient world, taunts archaeologists with its absence. Did it sink into the Indian Ocean like a maritime Atlantis? Was it swallowed by the mangrove swamps of Tanzania's Rufiji Delta? The only clues are scattered shards of Roman pottery and Persian beads washing up on beaches, whispering of a place that once connected African gold with Indian spices and Mediterranean glass. Equally enigmatic are the Cassiterides, the legendary tin islands that Greek traders claimed lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Ancient texts describe these fog-shrouded isles where metal-bearing rivers ran bright with tin, a crucial ingredient for bronze. Were they the Scilly Isles off Cornwall, where tin mining dates back to the Bronze Age, or Galicia in Spain, whose Celtic name Cassiopeia echoes the ancient term? The mystery deepens with Phoenician shipwrecks found off Portugal's coast, their hulls packed with tin ingots bearing chemical signatures matching British ores. Were these daring sailors hiding their sources to protect monopolies, leaving behind riddles wrapped in nautical dead ends? Then there's the puzzle of Prester John's pepper groves. Medieval European maps place this mythical Christian king's realm somewhere in Ethiopia or India, where pepper vines supposedly grew guarded by griffins. The legend persisted for centuries, driving explorers like Vasco da Gama to scour the Indian Ocean for a kingdom that didn't exist. Yet the fantasy had roots in reality. Ethiopian Christian traders did control key spice routes through the Red Sea, their camel caravans carrying cinnamon and myrrh to Alexandria. The line between rumor and route blurred so completely that even Marco Polo's meticulous journals repeated tales of pepper harvested from serpent-infested jungles by naked tribesmen. More tantalizing are the ghostly salt roads that vein across the Sahara. Satellite imagery reveals ancient tracks visible only from space, pale scars where countless camel caravans trod over centuries, their paths now erased by dunes. Some lead to abandoned oases where wells still brim with sweet water, their surrounding ruins littered with Ghanaian gold weights and Sicilian ceramics. These fragments hint at forgotten way stations where Tuareg guides once bargained with Jewish salt merchants under stars brighter than any city light. Perhaps the greatest unsolved riddle is the fate of the Silk Road's white gold, the miraculous paper from Samarkand that revolutionized record-keeping from Baghdad to Barcelona. The Arabs learned papermaking from Chinese prisoners in the 8th century, but the exact route of this technological theft remains shadowed. Were the secrets smuggled in hollowed-out staffs like silkworm eggs, carried by Zoroastrian refugees fleeing Mongol armies? The answer died with those who kept the secret, leaving only the paper itself as testimony, folios of medieval contracts and poems, their fibers still holding the imprint of inked fingers from 1,000 years ago. These lost routes and phantom cities remind us that history's ledger is full of blank pages. For every Viking trading post excavated in Russia, there's a Malacca-like entrepot still waiting beneath jungle canopies. Every shard of Ming porcelain found in Kenya's Great Rift Valley suggests unknown voyages across the Indian Ocean. The silence of these gaps speaks volumes, proof that the medieval world was vaster, stranger, and more interconnected than our records dare confess. What we call mysteries are really invitations to look closer, to sift the sands for whispers of deals struck in forgotten tongues, of cargoes that vanished into time's fog without a trace. Picture yourself standing on the docks of 14th century Alexandria, the Mediterranean sun glinting off waves crowded with ships from a dozen nations. A Venetian galley sways at anchor, its hold gaping empty, your chance to fill it with whatever cargo your wits and nerve can secure. But here's the catch: you've got one shot, one season's wind, and a purse of silver that could either vanish like mist or multiply like rabbits. What's your play? Do you gamble on pepper from the Malabar coast? A single sack could buy a vineyard back home, but the route teems with pirates and rival merchants. Or maybe Sicilian sulfur, a lesser-known gold mine used for medicine and gunpowder, with fewer competitors but riskier buyers. Perhaps you'll play it safe with Tunisian olive oil, heavy but steady profit, or roll the dice on Venetian glassware so delicate half might shatter before reaching Damascus. Now imagine the whispers in smoky taverns where deals are made. A grizzled Armenian trader slides beside you, offering a tip. Forget spices, the real prize is alum. This unassuming mineral, essential for fixing dyes in textiles, comes from only a few mines near Constantinople. Control a shipment, and every cloth merchant from Flanders to Cairo will beg at your doorstep. But the Genos have already bribed Ottoman officials to block rivals. Do you risk smuggling it through Byzantine backchannels, or consider the human factor? That nervous young scribe in the corner claims his uncle runs the customs house in Acre for a cut. He'll have your tariffs, but can you trust him? Meanwhile, a ship captain swears the monsoon winds will shift early this year, urging you to depart now half-loaded rather than wait for the last spice auction. Every choice is a domino. Wait too long and the market floods, leaving your cargo worthless. Move too soon and you'll miss the year's best prices. The beauty of medieval trade wasn't just in the goods, but the gut instincts behind them. A Norse fur trader eyeballing the thickness of sable pelts new winter forecasts better than any almanac. A Persian carpet merchant could judge a woman's social rank by how she haggled over patterns. These weren't mere transactions, they were high-stakes performances where luck, skill, and sometimes sheer audacity separated bankruptcy from legend. So what's your move? The galley's sails are unfurling, the harbor bells tolling. That itch in your palms isn't just the Mediterranean heat, it's the thrill of the deal, the weight of risk and reward balanced on a knife's edge. Whether you'd bet on Baltic amber or Andalusian saffron, one truth remains. In the medieval marketplace, fortune didn't just favor the bold, it crowned those who could read the unseen tides of want and scarcity better than the stars themselves. From the camel caravans of the Silk Road to the container ships crisscrossing oceans today, The heartbeat of civilization has always pulsed along trade routes. Those medieval merchants haggling over Venetian glass or Malian gold weren't just moving merchandise, they were laying the invisible tracks our modern world runs on. Think about it, the spices that flavored a medieval feast now sit on your supermarket shelf. The Arabic numerals used to tally silk shipments calculate your paycheck. And the financial systems born in champagne fairs now let you tap a phone to pay for coffee. The threads connecting us today aren't so different from the ones that stitched together Constantinople, Samarkand, and Timbuktu, only now they're woven with fiber optic cables instead of camel hair. But here's what's truly remarkable. When a Norse trader trusted a Byzantine stranger to honor a contract, or when a Malian king sent gold across the Sahara without GPS or guarantees, they were gambling on something fragile: mutual interest. That same gamble powers every online purchase you make today. The medieval world's greatest invention wasn't the compass or the bill of exchange. It was the unspoken agreement that connection is worth the risk. As you scroll through global marketplaces on your screen, remember you're walking in the footsteps of those who crossed deserts and seas to bring the world closer. The medieval routes may have faded, but their legacy lives on in every idea shared, every border crossed, every handshake, virtual or real, that bridges difference. If this journey through history sparked your curiosity, why not join us for the next one? Tap that like button if you'd sail with us to ancient shipwrecks, lost currencies, or the hidden economies of the Viking Age. Drop a comment below what trade route fascinates you most. The conversation doesn't end here. It's been going on for 1,000 years, and you're now part of